Hi, Bruce Adolphe here with episode 15. Growing up, my idols were Leonard Bernstein, Victor Borge, and Danny Kaye, and I was obsessed with Stravinsky and Gershwin and Pete Seeger. There was an 8 by 10 glossy black and white photo of Pete Seeger with my parents and some other folk music lovers taken in the Adirondacks before I was born. It was kept in a loose collection of summer photos from the early to mid 1950s. My parents, Jules Adolphe and Anita Latucci, loved folk music from everywhere in the world and were devoted folk music dancers. They gave demonstrations and taught folk dancing every summer for years, first in the Catskills and later in the Adirondacks at the Wattrock Lodge, where eventually they took my brother and me for about 10 summers until we went off to the nearby Camp Saskatchewan to paddle canoes, folk dance, and perform in musicals. Pete Seeger must have given a performance at one of the resorts where Jules and Anita taught and posed with them after rousing the audience with a sing-along finale, picking and frailing his banjo while letting loose with his high, sweet, yet raw tenor voice. This land was made for you and me. If you knew the word frailing that I just said, you know more about banjos than most people, and you've probably guessed that banjo playing figures into this particular episode. It does. While I was obsessed as a kid with the music of Stravinsky and Gershwin and would play recordings of The Rite of Spring, Les Noces, and American in Paris on the home stereo in our living room so that the whole neighborhood could assess Bernstein's interpretations, I also listened to my parents' Pete Seeger records and wanted to sing and play the banjo along with him as the frog went a-courtin', and I wondered along with Pete, when will we ever learn? So I convinced my mother to take me to a local music shop to look at banjos. My parents loved the idea that I had caught Pete Seeger fever. We selected a sturdy 5-string banjo, and at the Sam Ash Music Store in Hempstead, we bought a copy of Pete Seeger's trusty recording and book, How to Play the 5-String Banjo. I had already taught myself to play folk guitar and some classical guitar, and now the banjo was a must because of Pete. The LP that came with the booklet folded inside the cover had a long, narrow, vertical photo of long, narrow Pete playing his extra long-necked banjo. Ever truthful and always a thoughtful educator, Pete started the instructions in the booklet by letting readers know that the banjo was brought to America by slaves who played a similar instrument in West Africa, and that Joel Walker Sweeney, a poor white Virginian farm boy, learned to play banjo from a slave in 1831 and started the banjo craze. Pete Seeger was as much a civil rights and anti-war activist as he was a musician, which made him even more beloved in our home, and his protest songs filled our living room throughout my growing up. Pete wrote and sang songs to educate and uplift and to inspire both thought and action. When I was 9, Pete sang Tom Paxton's song, What Did You Learn in School Today? I still remember the words and could feel the ironic tone of the protest song. I learned that everybody's free, and that's what the teacher said to me. My parents were both teachers. My father would never have told his junior high English students that everybody in America is free. He was passionately engaged with the struggle for civil rights. In 1963, when I was 8 years old, my father was invited to speak as a representative of the Anti-Defamation League at an African American church on Long Island a few months after the March on Washington. I went with him and sat in the back. I remember the enormity of the church and the intensity of the crowd, and I recall seeing my father standing at a pulpit far away and speaking dramatically into a microphone. He was president of the local chapter of ADL and was an ardent follower of Martin Luther King Jr. My father may well have known Joachim Prinz, the renowned rabbi in Berlin during the Nazi period, who later became a civil rights activist in the US and a close friend of Martin Luther King Jr. I wish I could know whether they had ever met, because Joachim Prince was a relative on my wife's side of the family. And I wrote a violin concerto about Joachim Prince called I Will Not Remain Silent. I wrote that in 2015. My father was the kind of teacher Pete Seeger envisioned for America, an educator who practiced what he preached, who believed that poetry and literature was meant to rouse the spirit to action, who would not leave the hard work for others to do. And he liked to sing. I quickly learned that Pete's banjo playing was stylistically eclectic. A bit of frailing mixed with picking and strumming, no bluegrass, but a hint of clawhammer, plus his left hand got around his banjo's extra long neck like a fiddler's hand, or perhaps it's more apt to say like the hand of a violinist, since his mother was a violinist, trained at the Paris Conservatory, and she taught at Juilliard, and his stepmother was the influential modernist composer Ruth Crawford. Pete's father was the composer and pioneering musicologist Charles Seeger, teacher of Henry Cowell. I didn't know all this about Pete's remarkable classical lineage when I worked my way through his banjo book, but I could tell he was a unique kind of person and musician, and his mix of maverick qualities and robust musicianship spoke to me. I wish I knew what it was like for my parents to see little me playing the banjo and warbling in falsetto the solo from Wimoweh, and then dancing maniacally an hour later to the shifting pulses of the Rite of Spring, and soon after that faking my way through a Gershwin tune with some rather personal chord substitutions at the Baldwin Spinet. My parents never stopped me from doing anything, and I guess they saw all the various musical stylistic adventures as part of one big musical drive. There was never judgment, never comparisons between the worth of different genres, nor of my abilities in them. Never did they say, put away the banjo and practice the piano, or stick to one instrument if you want to be any good, or school work first, then play music. Nothing like that, ever. Music was an infinite domain for me to explore, at least equal to academic subjects, and my parents were encouraging facilitators. After my father died, my mother would never seek another dance partner, and so she had no use for the many recordings of folk music from around the world they had collected. So when I was a student at the Kinhaven Music School, the summer camp in Vermont founded by David Dushkin, my mother donated the entire record collection to the camp. Kinhaven had recently started a custom of student dances once a week, and my parents' enormous collection quickly became the backbone of the dance tradition. Many years later, when my wife Maria and I visited our daughter Katya at Kinhaven, I was not expecting what we witnessed. The folk dance tradition was still going strong, and all the music my daughter and her friends were ecstatically dancing to were those very recordings. And the steps they all knew so well were the ones my mother had taught some of the staff when I was a kid. My mother and I first heard about Kinhaven backstage after a concert by Kyung-Hwa Chung, who had played the lullaby from Firebird transcribed for violin by Stravinsky with help from Sam Dushkin, who was to Stravinsky what Joseph Joachim was to Brahms. And Sam Dushkin was the brother of David Dushkin, Kinhaven's founder. We didn't know Kyung-Hwa Chung, but my mother always took me backstage to meet artists and encouraged me to ask them questions, which in this case resulted in my going to Kinhaven. I excitedly went to Kinhaven ready to play piano in chamber music and bassoon in the orchestra, and I brought with me a cheap high school viola, which I had no idea how to play, but I pretended to audition for the orchestra on viola. When the panel saw me and they saw that I didn't know how to tune it well and I was holding it awkwardly, they asked me politely, "What would you like to play on the viola for your audition?" I didn't say anything. They said, "What would you like to play?" So finally I said, "The bassoon." I also brought a classical guitar. I didn't bring my banjo because I didn't expect to use it at Kinhaven. Bringing the guitar turned out to be a good move. Within hours of my first day on the rolling green hills of Kinhaven, I overheard some buzz about an astonishing kid who could play Scarlatti keyboard sonatas on the guitar and was the only guitarist ever invited to attend Kinhaven, where it was normally required that you play an orchestral instrument or the piano. His name apparently was Elliot, and he was considered a guitar genius. So I took my guitar from its case and decided that I would somehow get this wizard Elliot to come to me and maybe I could shake him up a little. I sat down on a step in the ping pong room under the concert hall, held my guitar, and stared into space with a look of poetic perplexity. Soon a tall, lanky kid came swiftly in my direction. He said, "Are you a guitarist?" "Yes, I am," I intoned mystically. "Really? I thought I was the only guitarist here. They don't have a guitar teacher, but they took me anyway. What repertoire are you playing?" I remembered his Scarlatti keyboard sonata, so I said, "I have transcribed the Beethoven piano sonatas for guitar." Elliot said, "What? Seriously? You have to play one of those for me. I mean, please, I can't believe it." I lifted my hands above the guitar and held them for suspense, for what I hoped would be an unbearable silence. Then suddenly I strummed a few chords like I was about to launch into a campfire song, and Elliot broke out laughing. I admitted to him that I was a pianist and bassoonist and my main instrument was composing, and that I could perhaps play Where Have All the Flowers Gone on the guitar without much trouble. Well, Elliot Fisk and I became friends at that moment. Flash forward to 2016, I invited Elliot, now of course a world-renowned guitarist, to perform a solo recital including a world premiere in Fort Collins, Colorado at the Off the Hook Arts Festival, of which I'm artistic director. Elliot and I remained friends and started emailing about whatever conversations came into our minds, but it became about human rights, the human rights struggles throughout the world. Pete Seeger died in 2014, and his devotion to justice, human dignity, and freedom inspired me to write a work dedicated to Pete Seeger for Elliot Fisk, the premier, thinking of the guitar as the natural connection between them. I called it, "When Will We Ever Learn?" The haunting refrain from Where Have All the Flowers Gone? But soon I added other movements to the work, one dedicated to civil rights leader Fannie Lou Hamer, another to Chief Seattle, and a finale based on the song Let It Shine. Pete Seeger wrote the song Where Have All the Flowers Gone in 1955, the year I was born, when Pete was 36. 56 years later, I wrote a piano puzzler in the style of Debussy based on Where Have All the Flowers Gone for performance today, and immediately after it aired, American Public Media received an email from Kenneth Marsh, Executive Director of the Woodstock Institute for Science in the Service of Humanity and Honorary Ambassadors Coordinator of the Global Harmonization Initiative. He offered to send a recording of the piano puzzler to his friend Pete Seeger. Well, I never felt more like frailing in my life. Luckily, I could frail a bit to celebrate Pete Seeger's hearing my piano puzzler based on his beloved song because I still had a banjo. It was not the banjo of my youth. That one I gave to a friend named Christopher Diamond when he graduated high school, and I, a few years older than Chris, was a composition student at Juilliard and no longer interested in banjo playing. I bought this new banjo on the internet when my daughter Katya was a baby because I wanted to play Kumbaya and Hush Little Baby on the banjo so as not to resort to playing recordings, even Pete Seeger recordings, for her lullabies. Maria and I did play some Pete Seeger discs for Katya, but of course we preferred to sing to her ourselves, as Pete would encourage folks to do. Peter Seeger. Pete Seeger really did ask the right question. When will we ever learn? Now here's that piano puzzler. Thank you for listening to my memoirs.